Chapter 3 Class Day. By 6 o'clock the following morning, Emily was on her way to the cemetery. She had set her alarm clock for 5, for she had to practice her oration in the opera house at 1. She must have a final fitting on her graduation dress, and in the evening came the Class Day program. It was a day on which to get a head start. She walked briskly, dressed for action in an old middy blouse and skirt. Over one arm hung a pail containing a small rake, a trowel, garden shears, and 3 empty quart jars. The other arm held big bouquets of snowballs and lilacs, tulips and painted daisies, their stems wrapped in newspapers which had been soaked in water. She had picked them in her own yard while the birds trilled a welcome to their early morning world, and had breakfasted softly, leaving her grandfather's coffee on the stove. Beyond the slough, most of the houses were still sleeping, but at Annette's house a curl of smoke suggested that Minnie might be getting breakfast. A milkman's wagon was rattling from door to door. "Hello," the milkman called in a muted voice. He, too, seemed to feel the camaraderie of the hour and nodded at her flowers. "The missus and I are going up there this afternoon," he said. It was too bad, Emily reflected, turning east to Broad Street, that she had to go so early, for the cemetery on the afternoon before Decoration Day was a very social place. It was full of people putting their family graves in spick and span order. At the Episcopal Church, she took the curving road up the cemetery hill and passed through the tall arched gate. This town of marble and granite monuments was even quieter than the one she had left below. Silvery cobwebs lay unbroken on the grass. Only a callous bobolink disturbed the stillness, and Emily made her way with a hushed tread past modest crosses, stately obelisks, and the snowy statue of an angel to the Webster plot, which had a square granite monument with headstones marking the places where her grandmother, father, and mother lay. At the foot of the graves her grandfather had placed a small white iron bench. Ivy covered the headstones, and a moss rose bush, which her grandmother had planted, stood between the graves of Emily's father and mother. Lilies of the valley on her grandmother's grave had spread untidily. "I'll have to clear them out," thought Emily. She looked down at the headstone on which a pair of clasped hands was chiseled. The lettering read, "Emily Clark Webster, born 1835, died 1904. She hath done what she could." Emily remembered her well, a cheerful, big-bosomed old lady. She was something of a personage in Deep Valley, for she had been its first schoolteacher. Far back in the 50s, when the town was less than a year old and she was a girl fresh from New Hampshire, Emily Clark had opened a little school in her father's parlor. There had been 14 pupils. In the last decade of a busy, useful life, she had taken her granddaughter to raise. "You always did do what you could," Emily said affectionately. "Well, I had better get to work." Putting down her pail, she thinned out the 2 lavish lilies of the valley. She raked the dead leaves, clipped the long grass, and dug a hole on each mound, into which she sank an empty jar. Taking her pail, she went to a nearby pump for water. She filled the jars and inserted the still dewy bouquets. As she worked, she continued to think about her grandparents. Cyrus Webster had come out to Minnesota from Ohio, lured by the newly ceded Indian lands. A seminary graduate, he had been attracted to the enterprising young teacher. They were married and staked out a claim over a valuable limestone formation which, after the Civil War, he had quarried with great profit. But his only son had been killed in an accident there. Emily glanced at her father's dates. Fred Webster, 1868 to 1896, said his headstone under a chiseled open book, presumably the Bible. For all her grandfather's loyal evasiveness, Emily gathered that her father had not been too successful in the quarry or any place else. Fred Webster had been a changeable, too optimistic young man. He had looked, she understood, like Uncle Chester, who was floridly handsome. But Uncle Chester had had the business ability his cousin lacked. He had taken Fred's place in the quarry and had risen from foreman to be superintendent and then partner. He ran it alone now. Emily's slow gaze passed to her mother's headstone. There was a chiseled cherub above Charlotte Benton Webster, 1873 to 1894. 1894 was the year of Emily's birth. Lottie Benton had been a teacher too. She had come all the way from Binghamton, New York, to teach in Deep Valley. No wonder I want to go to college, Emily thought. 2 teachers in the family. Lottie had married Fred Webster in his parents' home. Her own parents were dead, and she had left no relatives in Binghamton. Lottie was a dear, pretty girl, her grandfather always said. She was just the one for him. He'd have settled down if she had lived, her grandmother had told her. Your father didn't deserve her, Uncle Chester had said bluntly. But somehow nothing that anyone ever said made her mother real to Emily. The photograph on her bureau of Lottie Benton wearing the frizzed bang, tight basque, and looped polonaise of the 80s had never come to life. Emily sat down on the bench to rest. Her exertions had loosened her hair, which broke into curly tendrils around her broad brow and quiet eyes. She sat with her head bent and studied her mother's headstone. How different her life would have been if her parents had lived. It was strange to think that she might have had brothers and sisters and girlfriends coming for supper or to study and stay all night. She had heard the other girls mention doing this, but she had never done it in her life. Boys and girls would have come to play the piano or phonograph as they did at Annette's. Boys would have called her to go to parties, and her mother would have looked her over before she started. Emily had once gone to a party with Annette, and she had never forgotten how Aunt Sophie had asked Annette to turn around, watching critically for a hint of petticoat or hair out of place. Emily bent down impulsively and touched her mother's grave. I wish you could be here to see me graduate. Father, too, she said. She remembered the tickets she had received for commencement. Each member of the class had been given 6. Emily had used for only 1, and she had felt queer when the other girls were discussing how they would manage with so few. She had wanted to offer her extra ones, and she would, of course, before the day came. It occurred to her now with an unexpected stab that if her parents had lived, she might have needed every single ticket. Well, I'm glad I have Grandpa, she thought, and loving thankfulness swept over her. I'm glad, even if I can't go to college. She jumped up. Everything looked fresh and tidy. The graves would be a credit to her and her grandfather when the crowd came up to the cemetery tomorrow. Going down the hill, her empty pail over her arm, she met Hunter Sibley and his 2 younger brothers coming up. Doesn't your family come in the afternoon? She asked. Sure, answered Hunter, but we kids want to decorate Uncle Aaron's grave ourselves. What a lovely idea! Emily warmed with pleasure. The Sibleys' Uncle Aaron had been in the 1st Minnesota along with her own grandfather. This was a tribute to him, too. It was Jerry's idea, said Hunter, and nodded, smiling at the middle brother, a short boy who still wore knickerbockers, although he was a junior in high school. Emily knew him well, for he, too, was a debater. Jerry held up his bouquet. "Look what I found." "Lady slippers!" cried Emily. "They're beauties." "I'm going to put on flags," said Bobby, a 10-year-old with unruly hair, mischievous eyes, and big front teeth. "Flags!" he shouted. "And when I put on flags, I put on flags." Both his hands were full of flags of all sizes. Waving them violently, he started to run up the hill. Emily laughed with the warm enjoyment she always found in children, and proceeded on to Front Street and over the slough. Her grandfather was waiting for her at the gate, his round face, beneath the skull cap, sober. "How did the graves look?" "Just fine, Grandpa. I took out nice bouquets." "What did you put on your grandmother's grave?" "Lilacs." "She always liked them," the old man said with satisfaction. "And what do you think the Sibley boys were doing?" She described their pilgrimage, and a flush came into his old cheeks. "When Colonel Colville told us to charge," he said, "nobody ran on that field any faster than Aaron Sibley." "You ran fast enough to get a bullet through your arm." "Only winged, only winged," he answered impatiently. "It might have been death for any one of us." It was for a good many of them, Emily remembered. She had heard her grandfather say many times that only 47 had come back out of 262 who had made the gallant charge. After pumping a pail of fresh water, she went in to get dinner. She put potatoes to boil, fried pork chops, and opened a jar of tomatoes she had canned the summer before. She laid a cloth on the dining room table and put on jelly, bread and butter, a pot of tea. They sat down, and her grandfather said grace. Through the bow window in which his easy chair stood, they could see small crooked willows and the slough still wet from the spring rains. Some Syrian boys had made a homemade boat in the pond. "They killed a snake out there this morning," her grandfather remarked. Presently he asked, "Emmy, did you press my uniform?" "Yes, Grandpa, I pressed it last night." "That's fine, that's fine. Judge Hodges was here this morning. He and I don't want to ride in autos the way the mayor asks. We want to walk. Show 'em we can." "Well, don't walk too far," Emily answered absently. She was used to hearing him tell the same story, and herself making the same responses, over and over. "I'm glad those Sibley boys appreciate their uncle, Emmy." "They're nice boys. Hunter is the president of our class, you know." "Grandpa, I have to go to the opera house this afternoon. I have to practice my oration." He looked puzzled. "You told me what that was about, but I've forgotten." "It's about Jane Addams and Hull House." "Oh, yes, you said it for me. It was fine." Gettysburg, Emily Clark Webster, Fred, and Lottie slipped into the past. While she washed the dishes and her grandfather napped in his chair, Emily recited her oration. "A woman has awakened the social conscience of this generation." She enjoyed reciting it, for she liked the story of Jane Addams, who had grown up in nearby Illinois, had been graduated from Rockford Seminary there, had traveled abroad, and had been so touched by the miseries of the poor that she had decided to devote her life to helping them. She had done it in such a strange, interesting way, by going to live among them, taking a big house in a poor, crowded, foreign section of Chicago, and then just being a good neighbor. Hull House had resulted, a settlement house, it was called, a hospitable center of fun and useful activity for young and old. "What a wonderful thing to do!" Emily thought, running upstairs to change her clothes. If I could go to college, I would train for work like that. I would love to go to some big city and start another Hull House. Miss Fowler, the little dark-eyed English teacher, was waiting on the stage of the opera house. The big front curtain was rolled halfway up to show rows of empty seats. I'm going to sit down in the parquet and listen first, and then I'll go up in the balcony, Miss Fowler said. She came from Boston and spoke with an Eastern accent. I'll take your paper, although I know it isn't necessary. You won't need prompting. I don't think I will, said Emily. She liked to address an audience and was used to it from debating. Miss Fowler applauded from the gallery, and when she returned to the stage, she put her hand on Emily's arm. Your oration is very good, she said. It sounds as though it had just sprung from your own thoughts about Jane Addams. It did, Emily answered. Of course, I've done a lot of reading, too. But she really interests you. Yes, she does. I think I would like social work. Emily, said Miss Fowler, looking at her thoughtfully, I wish you could go to college. You can afford it, I know. It's a matter of leaving your grandfather, isn't it? Yes. Wouldn't a housekeeper? No, he's 81. I've lived with him all my life. The German college has classes in English, but he's been waiting for me to get through high school. He doesn't realize, she stopped. Oh, well, said Miss Fowler, it isn't necessary. College would help you to get where you're going, but you'll get there just the same. Emily didn't answer. She ached when she thought about college. So many of the girls in her class were going to Carleton or St. Catherine's or the State University. Mabel Scott, another honor student, was going east to Vassar, where Kearney Sibley, Hunter's older sister, went. No girl in the class would get as much out of college as I would, thought Emily, walking up Front Street. She swallowed hard, but I mustn't even think about it. She turned in at the butcher shop and bought a chicken for Decoration Day. She stopped at the shop of Windmiller, the florist, to order flowers for herself for Friday. The other girls would be receiving them from her parents, but her grandfather wouldn't know how to go about buying flowers. He wouldn't mind her buying them, though. We have plenty, Emily, he had told her when she was 14, and illness had forced him to retire from the quarry. Each month he gave her the money for their modest living, and if she needed more, she had only to ask. She seldom asked, however, for she had been trained in thrift. She approached Mrs. Windmiller with friendly dignity. Will you send me a dozen pink roses Friday afternoon? They're for my graduation. I'll pay for them now. At Annette's, the two dresses were finished, pressed, and laid out on the bed. Grandma Ledoux came to see Annette in her ruffled organdy and stayed on with kindly interest to admire Emily, too. We'll call for you and your grandfather tomorrow night, Aunt Sophie said. Oh, thank you, Emily cried. She had been wondering how they would get to the opera house. Emily, Aunt Sophie had asked, looking trifling embarrassed, are you using all your tickets? My tickets? Yes, for commencement. I know you each got 6. Could you spare us 3? We need them desperately. Of course. They're in my pocketbook. Aunt Sophie accepted them with fervent gratitude, and after Emily had packed her dress in a box, they went down to the back parlor to see Annette's presents, which were spread out on the center table, each one in its bed of tissue paper. 36 so far, Grandma Ledoux said proudly. Annette was busy with the photographer, but Emily lingered, looking at the dazzling array. When she said goodbye, Aunt Sophie and Grandma Ledoux each handed her a tissue-wrapped package. Emily flushed with pleasure. For me? Of course, said Aunt Sophie. Graduation presents. Emily smiled all the way across the slough. It was exciting to have two graduation presents. She had known, of course, that she would receive some, but still it was nice to have them appear. One box was oblong, the other round. I'll open them with Grandpa, she thought. This time he was waiting in his chair in the dining room window. Emily ran in and sat down on a stool beside him. "Is the sun going to set red?" he asked. "Why, yes, Grandpa. Look what Aunt Sophie and Uncle Chester have. If the sun goes down red, it'll be fair tomorrow." "It will be fair, all right, Aunt Sophie. Judge Hodges and I aren't afraid of the heat," her grandfather said. "Emmy, did you press my uniform?" "Yes, Grandpa, I pressed it." She was quiet, and her interrupted sentence must have echoed in the silence, for her grandfather asked suddenly, "What about Sophie and Chester?" "They gave me a present for my graduation, and so did Mrs. Ledoux. I brought them home to open with you." She showed him the packages. Her grandfather beamed with pleasure. "Now that was nice of Sophie and Chester," he said. Emily took up Aunt Sophie's box. She untied the ribbons as slowly as possible to draw out the fun. "What do you suppose it is? A bracelet?" "Hurry up. Let's have a look at it." She unfolded the tissue paper and lifted the cover off the box. Twilight was dimming the little dining room, but there was still light enough to see. "Grandpa, look! It's one of those new fountain pens." "A fountain pen? What kind's that?" "You can fill it with ink. You don't need to keep dipping it in the ink pot all the time," Emily explained. Her grandfather examined it in pleased bewilderment. "Now that was nice of Sophie and Chester," he said again. Grandma Ledoux had given her a sewing bag made of violet satin, very handsome. Happily, Emily arranged the two presents in their beds of tissue paper on the parlor center table. She took her dress out of its box and put it on a hanger. They went to the kitchen, where she set out bread and milk. "I'll have to eat quickly," she said. "I'm going to the high school tonight for class day exercises." Her grandfather didn't answer, but when he had finished his supper, he put down his spoon and looked at her. His head was held low, as she so often held her own, and his eyes, under puzzled brows, glanced up sharply. "Emmy," he said, "oughtn't I to give you a graduation present?" "Pshaw!" said Emily. "You're giving me my pretty white dress." "That's not a present." "And I'm buying roses for graduation night. They are really a present from you." She jumped up, smiling. "I have to hurry now and change my dress. You get to bed early on account of decoration day tomorrow." Class day was a riot of fun. Lights were blazing over the packed assembly room. The platform was concealed by a cambric curtain which billowed out grotesquely as concealed figures moved behind its shelter. Now and then Skid Edwards thrust his face, heavily painted and with blackened eyebrows, between the curtains to grimace at the crowd, which responded with cheers and laughter. The senior girls, the ones who weren't in the play, wore their class dresses. Emily's was made of corn-colored silk with long sleeves and a long, slim skirt. She sat with Mabel Scott, a tall, dark, fragile girl who, like herself, didn't go with boys. They sat near the front, where they wouldn't miss a ripple of the fun. The play, called One Night Only, was interrupted continually, not only by forgotten lines, but by uproarious laughter. The author's jokes were much less effective than Jim Baxter's difficulties with the monocle he wore as Lord Mulberry, or Hunter on his knees to Nell Hennessy, his wife, or Skid's exaggerated courtship of the maid, Annette, who wore a cap with long floating strings. The audience stamped clapped and whistled when Skid kissed her. Between the acts, the class papers were read to tumultuous applause. The class will gave Emily the Carnegie Library. In the class prophecy, it was predicted that she would debate in the United States Senate. In the midst of the clapping, which followed that, Hunter started a cheer. It had been used all season at the inter-school debates. There's Webster, King, and Walker, and they can talk a few. With such an aggregation, we won't do much to you. Emily had never thought to hear it again. Her surprise and pleasure almost choked her. The evening ended with the class song, written to the tune of I'd Love to Live in Loveland. We hate to leave the high school to a crowd like you. The class of 1912 was jammed on the stage together. Those who had taken part in the play, still wearing their makeup, their red cheeks, black eyebrows, and fantastic hair. Arms were hooked. Everyone was swaying in unison. Emily's eyes were shining, but inside she kept remembering that class day was the last event before commencement. The award assembly and the junior senior banquet had slipped away. Soon this would be gone too. She looked, as she always did, for Don. Annette, hanging on his arm, caught her eyes and winked with roguish affection. Emily returned to the joyous rhythm of the song. We hate to leave the high school, she sang, swaying with the rest.